When Arlen Cobb bought the old hunting cabin at the edge of Persimmon Hollow, the first thing he did was plant trees. Not just a few for shade, but hundreds of them, ringed tight around the cabin in 3 staggered rows. Spruce and fir and hardy little pines he ordered by mail and carried up the ridge in a wheelbarrow, 1 load at a time, through the whole of that first autumn. The men at the feed store laughed about it over coffee. They said a man who plants a forest around his own front door is either a fool or running from something, and either way he'd regret it come winter, when the drifts piled up and the wind had nowhere to go. But straight through his walls, Arlen never once explained himself to them. He wasn't the explaining kind. He was 51 years old, a widower 3 years running, and he had come to the hollow the way a wounded animal comes to high ground, not to be admired for it, just to survive it. His wife, Dinah, had loved trees the way other people loved music. She used to say that a house without trees around it was a house standing naked in front of the sky, and that the sky, for all its beauty, was not always kind. He had laughed at her for it once, gently, the way you laugh at the people you love best. Now the words came back to him at night like a hand on his shoulder, and he found himself digging holes in frozen dirt just to feel close to her again. The town watched him work through September and October with a mixture of pity and amusement. Old Ferris Boone, who ran the hardware store, told anyone who'd listen that Cobb was wasting good money on saplings that wouldn't do a thing but drop needles on his roof. Cobb's nearest neighbor, a big-boned rancher named Hellis Prentice, drove up once just to see the spectacle, sat on his truck bed, and shook his head at the sight of a grown man on his knees in the cold, patting soil around a tree no taller than his shin. "You planting a windbreak or a wall, Cobb?" Hollis called out. Arlen only wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "Bit of both, I expect," and went back to digging dot by the time the first snow came in November. The trees stood in their rows like a silent congregation, small and stubborn, barely taller than a man's waist. It didn't look like much. It looked, if anything, like the beginning of a mistake, exactly as the town had predicted. But Arlen had studied the land longer than anyone knew. He'd walked that ridge for 2 full seasons before he ever broke ground, watching where the wind came screaming down off the mountain, where the snow gathered itself into walls 8 feet high, where the old-growth forest a half-mile off had been shattered like matchsticks in a storm. Nobody in town still living could properly remember. He hadn't planted trees at random. He'd planted a fortress, exactly where the wind would have to fight for every inch of ground it wanted from his door. January came in hard that year, harder than anyone in 3 decades could recall. The temperature dropped to 20 below and stayed there for the better part of 2 weeks, and the wind off the peak turned vicious. The kind of wind that could strip paint and snap fence posts and, in one terrible night, tore the roof clean off Hollis Prentice's cattle barn and sent it tumbling across 2 pastures like a sheet of paper. Down in town, pipes burst, power lines snapped under the weight of ice, and half the county lost heat for 3 days running. People huddled in their kitchens, burning furniture for warmth and telling each other it was the worst storm any of them had ever lived through. Up on the ridge, Arlen Cobb's cabin stood quiet inside its ring of young trees, and something strange happened. The trees, small as they were, had grown thick enough and close enough over that one autumn to catch the wind before it ever reached the walls. Snow that would have piled against the cabin in murderous drifts instead caught in the branches, and dropped soft and scattered around the base of the trunks. The worst of the gusts broke apart against that first outer row, spent their fury on branches that bent and did not break, and reached the cabin only as a whisper of what they'd been 100 yards up the slope. Arlen sat by his fire that week and listened to a storm the whole county would talk about for years, and inside his small green fortress, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. He felt safe. It was Hollis Prentice who found him 3 days into the worst of it, half his own barn gone, his cattle scattered, no shelter left standing on his land worth the name. He came up the ridge on a borrowed snowmobile, desperate for anywhere to put his herd, and what he found at the top of that ridge stopped him cold. Cobb's cabin sat there calm as a held breath, smoke rising straight and easy from the chimney, while everywhere else on the mountain the wind still screamed. The trees Hollis had laughed at in September stood packed together now, snow-heavy and bowed, absorbing blow after blow that should have flattened everything behind them. He stood in that strange, sudden quiet and understood all at once exactly what he was looking at. Arlen didn't say "I told you so." He never was that kind of man. He just opened his gate, and the ground behind those trees, sheltered and still, took in 40 head of frightened cattle that night. And Hollis Prentice slept on Arlen's floor by the fire, too shaken to feel proud enough to refuse the kindness. Word got around fast after that, the way word does in small places. Ferris Boone drove up 2 days later, not to laugh this time, but to stand at the edge of that living wall and run his hand along a bent, frost-heavy branch like he was apologizing to it. Other families who'd lost roofs and whole seasons of certainty came up in the weeks after, not for shelter exactly, but just to see it, to stand inside that quiet ring where the wind couldn't reach and try to understand how a man everyone had mocked for planting. A forest around his door had built the one thing on that mountain that held. Spring came slow that year, the way it does after a hard winter, but when it finally arrived, Arlen found something waiting on his porch he hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, a crate of saplings, hardy little pines just like his own, left there by Hollis Prentice with no note attached, no words needed. Arlen understood it well enough. He carried them out past his own tree line, toward the ridge that faced his neighbor's ruined barn, and started digging holes in soft spring dirt for a second fortress that wasn't his to keep. He thought of Dinah while he worked, of naked houses and unkind skies, and understood finally that what he'd planted in his grief had grown into something larger than his own protection. It had grown into proof that the things people call foolish, the quiet, patient, unglamorous work of building shelter for the years nobody else believes are coming, are sometimes the only thing standing between an ordinary life and a ruin nobody saw fit to prepare for. He kept planting long after the crate was empty, and long after that, other people on that mountain started planting too. Families who had once shaken their heads at him now kneeling in their own frozen dirt, learning the same patient lesson he had learned alone. Persimmon Hollow was never quite the same mountain it had been before that winter. It became, slowly and without anyone announcing it, a place that understood shelter was something you built years before you needed it, with your own 2 hands, out of love for people who hadn't even arrived yet to be grateful for it.